welcome back to the DTVC Extra podcast. In this episode, we're going to start our look at the Beverly Hills Cop franchise. We'll be looking at number 1 and 2. So we'll start here with number 1. And of course, before we get into this episode or this movie, we should probably do a little, how did we get here kind of thing, right? Because that's something we always do. It's interesting too, because one of the things when I was, whenever I'm looking at series to review, it's the availability piece of it, right? And one of the things I didn't realize about Eddie Murphy is that he had an almost exclusive contract with Paramount, starting as far back as the 80s. So a lot of his movies are on Paramount Plus, including these Beverly Hills Cop movies, which worked out really well. When we look at this movie here, this Beverly Hills Cop film, I guess the original sort of concept was conceived maybe as far back as the 70s when Michael Eisner, who I think one time I remember being the CEO of Disney, but I think he was, major producer, right? Movie executive. When he first came to LA, he had a junky car, and I guess the valet looked at him funny, and he had this idea of like what it would be like driving a junky car into LA and sort of the status and all that kind of thing that goes with that. And then, as they're starting to sort of craft out this idea of a buddy cop movie. They had this idea of a character who was originally from Pittsburgh, who's like in East LA, and then gets transferred to Beverly Hills. And then they realized, well, you can't be transferred to Beverly Hills because Beverly Hills is a different city from LA. So it's not like it's just a different precinct in LA. So that didn't exactly work. So they thought, okay, well, we'll have it be someone maybe who started out in Pittsburgh and then moves to LA and or moves to goes to Beverly Hills, but still having that juxtaposition. So the original plan was to have this movie done by Sylvester Stallone, and of course, if you think about the early '80s, right, we talked about in the last series of films, he has the huge success with Rambo. He's got the Rocky movies that are highly successful. So he's someone that you'd want to get in a movie at this time. So they start working out the concept with him, and of course, they had this more of a buddy cop feel to it. It's interesting because it's not quite like a 48 Hours traditional buddy cop movie where you've got the sort of two cops paired off, right? This Beverly Hills Cop, I think even the original conception of it was going to be more of like a group of buddies, right? Or maybe 3 buddies, right? Where you've got Axel Foley with Rosewood and Rosewood and Taggart. I know it's Rosewood because we live near Rosewood Street here in Philadelphia, so I should be able to get that name right. But anyway, so Stallone's attached to it. He starts kind of pulling apart the buddy cop aspect of it. And I was thinking about that too, because when you think of Stallone's movies, I mean, what is the one buddy? I guess Tango and Cash is like the closest buddy cop thing that he's done. And we did the Escape Plan movie with Schwarzenegger, but he's not really a buddy cop kind of person. He wants to be the hero. He needs to be the guy. But not only that, but he starts making the film darker and more serious. He changes the main character's name to Cabretti. Sounds familiar, right? So he changes the name to Cabretti. Rosewood was supposed to get killed off when made through the film. Poor Judge Reinhold. I don't know if they were going to use Judge Reinhold with this conception of it they had. But I think what they start to realize, and you've got like Bruckheimer involved, Don Simpson, they are starting to realize this is not the movie we wanted to make, right? This movie that Stallone wants to make is not the movie we want to make. And that while he might be bankable, we really feel wedded to our idea. We want to bring our idea back. So there's some stories about how they got Stallone off the picture. Now I think maybe the most common one is just that there was those differences in the script ideas. That Stallone was upset they weren't going to go with his script idea, or they didn't want his script idea, so he took the idea with him to eventually make Cobra. So this concept that he's working on here eventually does become Cobra. So that's where the Cobretti character, right? He brings that character with him. Bruckheimer had said that he had some guy who did these anti-aging injections in Switzerland who was like high in demand, and he says that he got Stallone bumped up the list to be able to see this guy, and that's what got him off the picture, was that he essentially had to leave the movie to be able to do this. So that's one piece of it. I think Steven Berkoff had said, I mean, do what you want with Steven Berkoff saying anything. He had said something to along the lines of that I guess that Stallone didn't like the orange juice that they had in his trailer. I would think he'd be kidding about that. I mean, if it was really such an issue, he still did do Rambo First Blood Part 2 as the baddie in that one. And again, Steven Berkoff, right? If you need a baddie in the 80s, you've got Steven Berkoff. he's there. He's going to do exactly what you need him to do. So it's here. But I mean, I'm sure he was probably taking the piss out of whoever was interviewing him when he said that. But it's still a funny idea, right? You mentioned like Stallone, like I don't know, I don't know if he got like the can of orange juice, right? Because back then it would have been the can, right? Would it have been like the large can that you pop the ends off, or you kind of like puncture each end so that you've got air coming through both ways and you kind of pour it in that way? Would have been like the concentrate, the stuff that you get in the freezer section. I think they still sell that concentrate. Remember that stuff? You plop it into the plastic pitcher and then mix it with water. You'd have to get a whisk to mix it with water. So there's that version. I mean, was it something like that? I mean, I guess you still had the cartons of orange juice too back then. But yeah, maybe he got instant and he was angry. He got like the frozen concentrate kind and he was pissed. He was like, I can't drink this guy's concentrate stuff. You get out of here. I'm off this film. I'm not doing this. I just love the idea of that. But I mean, I think it was probably just the differences in the ideas of what they wanted to do. But I mean, I do believe Stallone did go to Switzerland to get those injections, which is kind of crazy to think, too. I mean, I am 45 now, so I'm younger than Stallone was at that time. Stallone was born in 46, so in the mid-'80s, he would have been like 38, 39, so he's not even 40 yet. And he's worrying about those injections. And I do know, yes, in the 80s, being in your late 30s was older than being in your late 30s is now. I mean, a lot of my friends had their first kids when they were in their late 30s. I know, so, you know, I mean, right, I mean, thinking about back then, right, you'd be having kids in your 20s. I mean, juxtapose that with who we're going to be talking about in a second here, Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy was born in 61. He's in his early 20s making these movies. So you can imagine that Stallone might have felt a little like, I don't know, I don't know what's the term that I want, less relevant as he's starting to get older, and he wanted to maintain that relevancy. That you've got kids like Eddie Murphy coming up to take his spot. That could be a possibility. But it also goes to show that he was obsessed with this whole anti-aging thing from as far back as then when he was in his late 30s. When again, by my standards, that's not even old anymore. But I guess it kind of was still in the 80s. You considered the late 30s. I mean, whenever I watch something like Cheers, it blows my mind how young those characters are in Cheers and how old they look. So, yeah, I guess I can see that. But anyway, Stallone's out, right? And so now they're starting to kind of reel this thing back and get it back into what is eventually going to be what we understand to be Beverly Hills Cop. So they want it to be funny again. They want to make it a little bit more lighthearted, but still have the criminal aspects of it, the action aspects of it. So they're looking for a new star. And at that time, right, you've got Eddie Murphy, who had 3 out of 4, or actually 2 out of 3 bankable projects, right? He has 48 Hours, and then he had Trading Places, which of course was done here in Philadelphia. And then the other one he had there was Best Defense. I don't know if you remember Best Defense. I don't remember ever seeing that. It was a Dudley Moore movie. That one doesn't do that well. He has a small part. He's like a tank operator in that one. Yeah, I've never seen that one before. So it's probably one that I should check out myself. It's kind of a I think it would be an interesting one to see, kind of how that one goes. But it just the same, right? He's in demand at that time. He's just getting to that point where he's in demand, and when they were looking for someone to replace Stallone, he becomes the kind of that he comes to the top of the list, which is interesting because he was born in 1961, so he's playing a character that I would say is probably more in his like mid to late 20s, probably more like late 20s, you'd think, because the idea is like if he's supposed to come from this sort of reform school past where he's getting in trouble a lot, and then he's into the police force and he's already making detective, yes, he could be making it on a fast track, but I think his character is supposed to be older. So he's only 23 when he's making this movie, which again, contrast that with Stallone, who they originally had booked, who was 38 at that time. So a huge difference. But again, he's had this successful track record. He was very funny on Saturday Night Live. At that point, right? Remember, I didn't remember this, but when Nick Nolte was supposed to be on for 48 Hours and he was sick, Murphy was not only like a cast member, but he was also a host. Right? He's the only person to ever do that, I believe, to be a host and a cast member at the same time. But he was definitely a rising star. And so they get him into this and they go, okay, let's bring it back to the comedy that we wanted to have, the more offbeat piece of it. So let's not kill Rosewood off. So spoiler alert, if you haven't seen Beverly Hills Cop before, which I imagine you must have, but if you haven't seen it before, Rosewood survives. Nobody's killing off Judge Reinhold in this. So John Ashton as Taggart. We've got Ronnie Cox as Sergeant Bogomil, which, Bogomil, what a great name. It sounds like something that an Italian sword and sandal film it would have. Like maybe the wizard would be Bogomil, right? You can see like Miles O'Keefe going to find the wizard Bogomil, who's going to give him some special sword that he can use to fight the long-haired John Saxon guy or something. But anyway, that's it. I mean, and of course, hearing those names again, which is beautiful. But anyway, we're getting to where we're getting to the film here. They put this movie together. My understanding was that the Paramount execs, when they saw the opening that opening chase sequence with the rig with the cigarette truck that's like crashing through all the cars and everything, that they were sold on a sequel at that point. Now I do know after this that they thought about maybe doing a TV show, and Eddie Murphy was like, "Well, I don't want to do TV anymore. I'm doing movies." Of course, this is before the days of prestige TV. I think like the closest thing maybe to prestige TV at that time would be moonlighting, like we talked about on the Die Hard series episodes. And that's another thing too about this, right? Is that Eddie Murphy at the time, he was more known for comedic stuff as well, but I think with the 48 Hours, the buddy cop thing, they thought he would be perfect for a movie like this, which also has a buddy cop feel to it. And I don't know, from Eddie Murphy's standpoint at that time, he was so young that there would have been a fear of like, oh, I'm going to get pigeonholed into only action stuff if I do this, right? He's just like, I want to be in the big time. I want to be a big movie star. So let's take as many of these roles as we can and keep doing it. And I mean, he's hugely successful, right? This movie is a big hit. The second movie was even bigger, but this movie is a huge hit, solidifies him. I would say by the time the second movie comes out, when we get to the end of the 80s, Eddie Murphy is the #1 box office star, I would say, at least for leading men in America. Which again, it's interesting because we're talking about Stallone, we're talking about Bruce Willis in these. And definitely Stallone was somebody who was pushing for that. And he was close, right? I mean, we talk about like, he'd have years where Rocky and, Rambo, that those two movies, whatever he put one of those, put those movies out, they would be in the top 10 for earners that year. But Murphy's movies are doing even better, right? I mean, the Beverly Hills Cop movies are the ones that are topping Stallone's movies. I mean, his movies are beating everything at that point. I think, I guess like Harrison Ford's Indiana Jones sequels were doing really well. But Eddie Murphy, this movie is kind of the one that solidifies him as our #1 star. And it's going to be interesting as we go through this series of films because, today's episodes, today's movies, right, he's going to stay at the top. He's going to continue to be at the top. When we get into 3 and 4, right, we're going to see sort of a decline and maybe a return at that point. But it's going to be interesting, right? This is just all going to be about the high, all of the good stuff there. Yeah, I mean, I was trying to decide if I wanted to bother with a synopsis. Now, let's go over my own, experience watching this movie. This was one that I watched. It's been a long time since I'd seen it. I don't think it's been as long as some of these other ones that we've been talking about. I don't know if it's been 30 years. I don't think it's been 30 years since I've last seen it. But there were parts of it, I kind of didn't remember all of it. So, it's funny, like there's little bits of it that stick out, from when I would have last seen it. I mean, it may have been that long now that I think about it. But I always remember, like, for example, the scene he's in with Lisa Eilbacher where they find the coffee, right? And he's like, oh, that's coffee. And then he opens up the Coke. And he's like, but that's not sugar. Like, I don't know. As a kid, that one always stood out for me. Of course, the banana in the tailpipe, right? How do you forget that scene? Those are things, the robbery at the strip club with Vanity playing in the background. Just the music in general, right? Those are things I always remembered. But some of it, it had been a while since I'd seen it, and I'd forgotten. Or like for example, like the interrogation scene, right, where he talks about like did you destroy the buffet at the whatever at that place, like I remember that joke about the did you destroy the buffet at the but I didn't remember the rest. I didn't remember like that whole scene and how funny that whole scene was. And I think I'd even forgotten just how great of an action movie this was. Like, I knew it was really good, but I mean, watching it now, it's like, man, I other than Commando, I don't know, because Commando is like kind of my all-time favorite. I feel like I got to watch Commando again, right? Because it's been 5 or 6 years since I've seen that one, and just see if because this one definitely for me, I mean, it jumped past Die Hard, it jumped past First Blood Part 2. It to at least be my #2 favorite action movie of all time because it has everything going on in it. There's just so many fun elements to it, from the cast, the music, but you also get some really great action sequences, right? You get that, of course, you get the truck chase sequence in the beginning of the film, which is really great. You've got the strip club shootout, which isn't a bad sequence. You get a few things like that happen in there. I mean, the Eddie Murphy joke sequences are just amazing. And it's interesting because one name that came to mind was Richard Pryor in Superman 3. Like, for example, in that sequence where Eddie Murphy is going into like that storage location and he wants to get all the manifests or whatever to find out what Steven Berkoff is shipping into the country. and he's like doing this whole routine about how he's an inspector and all of that. And it reminded me of Richard Pryor in Superman 3, where he's showing up as like this army general giving Superman the kryptonite that has, tar from cigarettes in it. And it was really great. But then when you think about the fact that Richard Pryor was a lot older than Eddie Murphy when he's doing that scene, that Eddie Murphy is doing these kinds of scenes at 23 years old, just absolutely amazing. Just kind of blew me away that I didn't realize he was that young when he did those. And again, when I would have seen these in the 80s, early 90s, I was really young at that point myself, right? I would have, and there's that sense when you're, even in your teens, right? But at least in your, 8, 9 to, preteen age, someone in their early 20s is old, right? That's an old person. You don't really think about now that, like, wow, he was really pulling some shit off there at 23. He really looked the part there, which I thought was really good. So there's a lot of fun stuff in this movie. I mean, the music, again, I just brought up again, but I had forgotten, that Axel F was the song that kind of came out of the movie as the really, really popular one. Of course, The Heat Is On, great song. Turn It Up, Patti LaBelle, so another Philadelphia connection, right? We just talked about Trading Spaces. We got Patti LaBelle from Philadelphia here. I think "Turn It Up" was supposed to be the song that was supposed to be the number one, the huge hit from the movie, but Axel F ended up just being sort of this runaway, iconic song, that we just always remember the movie from the movie by. The Neutron Dance, right, which is the music that's playing as the truck is crashing through everything. Yeah, all of that stuff was just so much fun. And the fact that you can get these on Paramount Plus like this, and they're nice cleaned up versions of them, that just to me was amazing, because again, I would have been watching these on VHS. I would have been watching them on TV movie, which the TV movie versions, of course, they're going to be heavily edited. There's not going to be a lot of swearing, a lot of stuff like that in there. But seeing them on Paramount Plus like this was just fantastic. So so all of that really worked there. A few connections or a few things to mention. So Lisa Eilbacher, there was a movie that we did that she did with Lance Henriksen that we did on our site a little while back, called Deadly Intent. And so again, Lance Henriksen, Fred Williamson was in it as well. Lisa Eilbacher's character kind of gets run through the ringer in that film. But I was thinking that might be the only time we've seen her on the site, but actually that's not true. She was also in Live Wire. I think she played. Did she play Pierce Brosnan's ex-husband? I almost said Bronson Pinchot. I'm in Beverly Hills Cop mode. So Pierce Brosnan, not Bronson Pinchot, but Pierce Brosnan's wife or ex-wife, I think, in Live Wire. She was in that one as well. But so she plays the old friend living in California. And one of the interesting things about that is I think there was a sense that there was like a romance between them there, or there was a potential for a romance there, especially with them being old friends. And they never really went with it. And I think that was one of those signs. I think the fact that this was 84, that we weren't going to do that, right? That it would have been too much, I guess, for American audiences at that time to have a black leading man hooking up with a white woman as the lead. Remember at that time, a lot of times when you'd have black stars, or you'd have like kids, like TV shows where there would be a black character, like the black and the white, the black woman and the white woman, or the black and male and the black female would be together, right? And then the whites would, that's how you'd always pair it off, right? I remember, I guess they tried to do a Saved by the Bell. They did kind of like a Lisa Turtle. Screech had a thing for her, but that was never like anything that they did. There'd always be some guy who would show up who would look kind of like Boyz II Men, on the Alex Vanderpool kind of stuff that they would remember when they have the glasses and like the school outfits. That would be like he would be like guest star and be her date for an episode. So they weren't going to go that far with this, but there was a sense that as old friends that could have they could have gone there with it. I guess it doesn't matter either way that they didn't. I think that was the thing though too, right? Was that Stallone in the original script, his character was going to have a relationship, whether it was Lisa Eilbacher or whoever played that character, he was going to have a relationship with her. And so they just wrote it out completely. So, and I don't. It would have been interesting to see too, because Eddie Murphy being that young. She was like 5 years older than him, so she would have been in her late 20s for that scene. But yeah, they just did. They never went with it. They never did it. But again, it was interesting seeing her, because it's interesting seeing her in this big movie like this, and then she kind of just falls back into these DTV things and doesn't really grow beyond that. That kind of thing happens there, I guess. Some of the other names in this, I think one big one, there is a documentary on Netflix about this White Boy Rick. I don't know if you've heard of White Boy Rick, but he was a kid growing up in Detroit in the late 80s who was, I think he was like 14 years old, becomes an FBI informant on the huge drug trade that was happening there at that time, and then ends up getting busted for selling coke himself, whether it was because maybe he wasn't protected by the FBI anymore, not sure exactly what happens there. But Inspector Todd, right, played by Gil Hill, who was an actual Detroit police officer at that time. If you watch this documentary, they get into kind of some of the stuff that Gil Hill was into at that time. And so word on the street is that, one, he had hired a notorious Detroit gang hitman to kill White Boy Rick, because White Boy Rick apparently knew about what Gil Hill was into. And also the reason why he spent a lot of time in jail when all the other people that were involved with the drug deals and the drug trade in Detroit in the late 80s have been out of jail, including that notorious hitman. They'd all been released out of prison for a long time, but he was kept there. It was because Gil Hill knew he had information on him. That was part of it. The other thing is he had a lot of friends. So like there was a lot of like DAs, council people. They all kind of came up under him, and so whenever it was brought to their brought before them to try to give this White Boy Rick guy a second chance or let him out of prison, or he's done his time, that kind of thing. These people, because they were so loyal to Gil Hill, they never even considered it. And finally, when he passed away, that was when they finally decided to. I don't know if he finally got out or he might be serving another case. I don't know exactly what happened there, but it's interesting because the way the documentary sets it up, the local Detroit news, when they were covering Gil Hill passing away, you got the anchor woman, and she's like, well, we lost a good one today. But they're setting it up as like, oh, she's saying we lost a good one, but it's more like a good riddance kind of thing, right? But yeah, really interesting seeing that now, right? Because, at the time it was like, oh, he's this Detroit, he's like kind of this figure to Detroit politics, Detroit policing. What a great guy he is, and look at him playing this part. I mean, he's hilarious in the movie when he's swearing at Axel Foley and all that stuff. It's a lot of fun, but yeah. So if you ever check that documentary out, it's on, I believe it's still on Netflix, about White Boy Rick. It's a whole interesting thing there. Just about the drug trade in Detroit in the late 80s and all of that. So we got that. Another guy we see a lot here on the DTVC podcast, or in the especially on the podcast, especially when Ty is on and we're doing those two movies from Tubi, Hulu, or whatever. James Russo, we see him in a lot of those. Really fascinating to see him younger, because we're just used to him now as this grizzled Italian guy who does crime stuff and whatever. And now, to see him there, he was born in 53, so he's actually at his early 30s when he makes this movie, but he looks younger. He looks like he's in his 20s, and it's such a trip to see him there. But I definitely love that. Ronnie Cox, interesting piece about this. Prior to this movie, he was known as the TV dad, or the TV movie dad, a very dadly kind of figure, fatherly kind of figure, and his performance in this movie opened up doors for him to play, kind of more gruff, villainous kind of characters. That's how he gets the role in RoboCop, is through his performance here. So really interesting, right? Because we know of him now from RoboCop. I mean, right at Captain America, that's how we saw him on the site, right? Albert Pyun's Captain America. He's been a few times on our site. We've definitely got a Ronnie Cox tag there. But yeah, reading about that prior to this movie, nobody thought that he could do these kinds of roles, and he kind of hits this out of the park, right? He's a lot of fun there. Yeah, I mean, John Ashton, we just lost him recently, and I think that kind of made this a little bit sad to see him here, knowing that he had just passed. One of the things I've always loved about his character, and I think it's something that came through again watching this, this movie, was, like there's a strip club scene. They go back to Ronnie Cox or Lieutenant Bogomil. I think I called him Inspector or Sergeant Bogomil, Lieutenant Bogomil. When they go to him after the strip club shootout, and Bogomil's like, well, what happened here? And Eddie Murphy goes in this big, huge spiel about how Taggart and Rosewood, they were super cops, and they saved the day. And Taggart's like, I'm not taking credit. Foley was the one who sussed this whole thing out. He did it. I'm going to, it was a fascinating thing to have a character like that who kind of has this, this honor code, but he's kind of not, sort of the main character in the movie. I don't know. It was something that it was always kind of spoke to me watching these movies, that I've always liked that character had that kind of sense about him. And it made his character a lot more fun to watch when he would go through different things in these movies, knowing that, he didn't take credit for something that he didn't do, and he didn't want Bogomil to think that he and Reinhold or he and Rosewood had done something that they hadn't. I always really loved that scene, and seeing it again was really cool. And then the other thing I didn't know about that scene was that a lot of it was ad-libbed. A lot of the movie was ad-libbed because, we were just talking about the fact that they were kind of rewriting the script, trying to bring it back from what Stallone had done. And then when they got Eddie Murphy, they wanted more jokes in there. And a lot of times he was ad-libbing the jokes because they weren't even written yet, which I think leads to the disaster that is Pluto Nash down the road, because I think he looks at his ability to do that in this movie. He does it in other movies, ad-libs a lot of his jokes. And so he tells the writers of Pluto Nash, just write a straight script and I'll add the jokes. And then when he got on set, he just didn't have it in terms of adding the jokes. So really interesting. But this is one of the first movies that he does this, where he just throws in all of the comedy. And apparently in that sequence where he's telling the story about the super cops and going through all of that stuff, Ashton and Reinhold were trying not to laugh because they wanted to get the scene in. They wanted to make it work. And there are sequences where he's, Ashton's kind of pinching his nose, sort of grimacing. And that's him trying not to laugh. And I guess Judge Reinhold was pinching his leg to get himself not to laugh while those scenes were happening. So it's kind of funny, looking back on that now, kind of finding all that stuff out, that was the case there. The other one, Jonathan Banks, character actor who, if Steven Berkoff was like your kind of your quintessential 80s baddie, Jonathan Banks was like your quintessential 80s like hardo, hard man kind of character. It was either him or Brian James, right? You throw Brian James, give him a dye job and a mustache, and he could throw a main character into a trash can, bags of trash out behind an alley with the best of them. But Jonathan Banks, he knows how to do it as well. Love seeing him do that kind of stuff. And then one of the interesting things that I had forgotten was that Michael Champion was his like kind of second in command, second in I don't know what second in the hierarchy of baddies or whatever. But remember him from what was it? Was it The Swordsman? Is that what it was called? The Lorenzo Lamas film, right? Where they made a sequel, which the sequel is just they pulled footage from the original one. But it is Champion. I think it's not Campion. I always get those names mixed up, but I think it definitely is Champion. Always fun to kind of see him do some of that stuff. Michael Champion. That was another good one there. We had some other people that passed away. Frank Pesci is in this as the cigarette buyer who comes back into the second one. I don't know if you can hear the cops coming. You can. Maybe I don't know if does that give a little bit more of a nice feel to kind of we're talking about Beverly Hills Cop and I've got sirens going in the background, but anyway, Frank Pesci, who been on the site a few times as well. Fortunately, he passed away relatively recently as well. So always love that. And someone like a Paul Reiser. I was talking about my friend Mike Palos, who I've mentioned a few times on here. I was visiting up in New England recently. We were chatting about this movie, and he had forgotten Paul Reiser was in it. And he's great. He's great with his New York accent in Detroit. I love that bit there. It's really worked. And then of course you've got your Bronson Pinchot, which my friends and I we would say Serge like that all the time when we were talking to each other. And again, it's like those moments in the movie where you see that. And apparently he couldn't be in the sequel because he was doing Perfect Strangers. That prevented him from doing the sequel, which is too bad. I think he's been in all the other ones, but he couldn't do that one because he was doing the sequel. But again, one of those memorable characters that you have in a movie that just always a lot of fun. Now one interesting thing, Judge Reinhold, he doesn't have his birthday on IMDb. He's just born May 21. I believe, and actually he's from Wilmington, Delaware. He's from the area here in near Philadelphia. One of the things, if you ever come to Wilmington, there is a really fun single A baseball team here, the Wilmington Blue Rocks, and they have three mascots, right? Because I guess you always have a bunch of mascots, but they have like the Blue Rock. It's like a rock with like a pick, or whatever, kind of like my Bloody Valentine. Then there's like a moose, right? The moose, I guess, is like the main mascot. But then when they first started using the stadium that they have, or the ballpark they have in Wilmington, in the back room they found this large celery costume. And I guess I don't know what they didn't know what it was used for or who was using it, but it was just like a big celery like mascot thing. So what they did is they coined him as Mr. Celery, and every time they score a run, Mr. Celery runs out to song 2. People had asked like what was the song? It's song 2 by Blur, so it's like not even like a really interesting song. But he just runs out like waving his arms around, Mr. Celery. And so I got a hat. I've got a Mr. Celery hat. I've got a couple bobbleheads for Mr. Celery, and I've also got a T-shirt because it's like one of the most fun things. The problem is it's not as easy for me to go to Wilmington, Delaware games as it is to go to the Phillies games. But yeah, it's just but anyway, that's my Wilmington, Delaware aside. But I was curious about how old he was because I don't think he's younger than Eddie Murphy. I almost called him Bruce Willis. I don't think he's younger than Eddie Murphy. But it's interesting because he was playing a high school student in 1982. And Eddie Murphy was closer to high school in 1982 than I think than Judge Reinhold was. But like just 2 years later, right? So he's playing a high school kid in 1982, and then just 2 years later, he is playing a full detective. At somebody who's definitely much older than what he would have been as 20, right? I guess he would have been 20. So that's really interesting. But one of the things about that character is that, of course, we've seen him on the site before with Cracker Jack 2. And this movie is just another reminder about how ridiculous he was to be cast in Cracker Jack 2. Because he's so perfect in this role as Billy Rosewood. And I think he's even more perfect in the next movie when we talk about that one. But I love him here. I mean, that scene when Eddie Murphy has them bring the room service to with the late dinner to the car, and there's Judge Reinhold like kind of putting things together and asking for more mayo and stuff like that. I mean, it's so Judge Reinholdy, right? It's so perfect, and again, it's one of those things that just makes this movie so fantastic. So yeah, I just all of that stuff just really worked there. I think this movie is one of those ones that just I completely forgot. The other piece I wanted to mention was, again, talking with my friend Mike about this movie, there's a sense of like, not just like 80s nostalgia in this, but there's an 80s aesthetic in this movie that is something that when people try to make things that take place in the 80s, they try to recreate the aesthetic, but it's almost like they're missing elements of it. When you watch this, there's something about it that just feels right. There's sort of a comfort food feeling. There's a fun nostalgia feeling seeing this, but it's also a feeling of like something that can't be recreated now. You can't just, you can't make something that takes place in the 80s. You can't shoot it and make it look like this movie looked. And it's something about that, watching this one, I think, more than any of the, movies that we've been seeing here. This one really, really hit home with that. Like, I just felt like I was, and I mean, 1984, I was only 5 years old, but I would have seen this movie later in the 80s when it was on TV or rented it or somebody got it on HBO. So it would have probably been like 87, 88 that I would have been watching it. But there was that aesthetic there, just really, really, I really felt that there. And I don't know, I don't know if, I don't think that's a fair thing to expect modern action movies to match this, to match this kind of vibe here. It's almost like it's not, I can't, John Wick, as much as I love like the John Wick movies, or as much as I love like, Captain America Winter Soldier or The Expendables or anything like that, right? There's no way that they're going to feel like this movie felt. 1980s Beverly Hills, and granted, like, this movie spawns this whole like Beverly Hills trend, right? You got Troop Beverly Hills and Down and Out in Beverly Hills, and then Taking of Beverly Hills. Like, Beverly Hills, there's a whole obsession with Beverly Hills, right? That just kind of goes, finally Beverly Hills 90210. Like, everybody wants to talk about Beverly Hills, but mid to late 80s LA, and especially like the Beverly Hills aspect to it, but even other parts of LA. I mean, anytime I watch a movie that's like going down like Sunset Boulevard or something like that in the 80s, there's something about it that just looks really beautiful that I just love. And this movie embodies so much of that. And again, it's something that you can't expect another movie to pull off, because there's no way that they'd be able to do it. There's no way that they could recreate this vibe here that this movie has for us. So it's an area where maybe it's not fair to expect modern action movies to live up to something like this. But yeah, I mean, I gotta watch Commando again at some point, but this is probably my number 2 now. I put this above Rambo First Blood Part 2. I put it above Die Hard. I can't believe it had been so long since I'd seen it that I'd forgotten how much fun it was. I knew it was fun. I knew I liked it. I knew it was a lot. I knew how good of a movie it was. But watching it again, I was just like, there wasn't a moment where I wasn't having a good time. The other piece, of course, is this movie comes in at a cool hour and 45 minutes. And I'll probably talk about this more in the second movie. But I think there is something to that about today's movies where this movie's plot goes very quickly. It only has a few confrontations with the hero and the baddie before we get to the final one. It only has a little bit of subterfuge before we get to the real meat of things. I think a modern movie would have had more red herrings. It would have meandered the plot more and gotten us to 2 hours and 20 minutes or something, where we don't really need to do that. And I think this movie maybe shows, and I don't know if maybe the reason for that is, and again, this is something I was going to talk about in the next one, and maybe I will talk about it more, but I wonder if there's a sense, because movies are so expensive now, and it's such a process to get out to the theater and all that stuff, when back then in the 80s, people went to movies all the time, if maybe there's a sense of okay, if people are going to spend this much money on the movie and do all of that, we got to give them more than just an hour and 45 minutes. I don't know if that's kind of the thinking there. But yeah, I keep trying to think if there's anything else that I can say about this. This movie is, if you haven't seen this one in a while, you really should pop on Paramount Plus if you have Paramount Plus, or rent it. Spend the $4 and rent it on something, because it's exactly what you want this movie to be. It's exactly what you want a movie like this to be. And again, I say they don't make movies like this anymore. They can't make movies like this anymore. You can't recreate 80s LA. Eddie Murphy's not going to be early 20-something Eddie Murphy anymore. Unfortunately, we lost John Ashton, so he's no longer with us. But you can't remake what this movie was. It exists in this capsule. But what's beautiful about the medium of film is that we can enjoy it. And what's beautiful about the streaming thing, as much as we don't like streaming and we're fans of physical media, the fact that you can just pop this thing on Paramount. I was watching it on a train. You can watch it on TV. You can watch it anywhere. The fact that you can do that, I think, is just such a beautiful thing. And yeah, so I had a lot of fun with this. I'm glad it reaffirmed that I was right to choose this movie series after doing this film. So yeah, maybe this is good. We'll take a break here on a good note, on a positive note here. And then when we come back, we'll look at the second film in the series.
It's the early 90s in LA. The war on drugs is raging, and Detective John Bainbridge is the LAPD's secret weapon against crime. Former Special Forces in Nam, he's a cop on the edge. When he and his partner Geary uncover a potential human trafficking ring, it doesn't take long before John Bainbridge realizes this thing goes all the way to the top, which doesn't scare him. That just means they'll fall that much harder when he takes them down. Part send-up and part love letter to early 90s action films, Bainbridge will take you back to the golden days of Canon, PM Entertainment, and AIP. You can get it in paperback or on Kindle and Kindle Unlimited from Amazon. Follow the link in the podcast description.
All right, we are back, and we're going to look at Beverly Hills Cop II now. So it is now 1987, right? We've fast forward 3 years, and the only movie that Eddie Murphy has done between Beverly Hills Cop and Beverly Hills Cop II is The Golden Child, one that I haven't seen in forever, so another one that I probably need to see at some point. It is successful in the sense that it makes a good amount more than its budget. I think the budget was $15 million, and it made $7 or $8. So Eddie Murphy is still a bankable star, but he's sort of focusing on this music career for a couple of years. My Girl Wants to Party All the Time. I remember all that stuff there. He does do Raw as well, but Raw comes out, I believe, after Beverly Hills Cop 2. At least they come out the same year. They both come out in 87. So, it's interesting because he's at this point where he's a really bankable star, and you'd almost think that he'd be, wanting to just load up on as many movies as he could. But no, he's sort of, again, trying to pursue this music thing and only takes the Golden Child. I think part of the reason why he took the Golden Child is that he liked the fact that it was different from the movies that he had done before. It had more of a mystical kind of magic element, sci-fi almost element to it. And I think he liked that part of it. Again, already thinking at that age, I don't want to get pigeonholed into comedies or action comedies, that kind of thing. So there's that there. And then when they were coming up with the idea, remember we talked about in the previous one that Paramount executives, they saw that opening chase scene and were like, oh, yeah, we'll greenlight a sequel right away. In that time period, though, in that 3 years, they looked at it some more and thought, this could actually be a really good TV series. And I think they had reason to think that would be a successful approach, because you think of something like MASH, right? MASH was a great movie, then it turns into a great TV series. And that TV series lasted for so long that, the amount of money that the TV series was able to produce versus how much that original movie, right? A sequel wouldn't have been able to produce anywhere near what MASH did. And if they thought they could have something along those lines, right? Thinking about it, right? If you could make that work, if a Beverly Hills Cop series had worked to the point of 9 seasons, 10 seasons, and rerun syndication and all of that, yeah, of course they'd see more dollar signs there. But Eddie Murphy said no to that. He was more interested in doing another movie. He didn't want to go back to TV. Going back to TV, it's kind of interesting saying going back to TV. I guess Saturday Night Live was him doing TV, but it wasn't like a scripted weekly show or anything like that he was doing. But that also kind of brings us back to another point. When it came to acting, doing TV was seen as a step down. You didn't really do TV. If you did TV at all when you were a movie star, you were doing it from the standpoint of like a guest appearance playing yourself. Also commercials, right? I remember, was it 60 Minutes or 2020 or one of those did a feature about American stars who were doing commercials in like Japan. And there's the Van Damme one with the black gum. There's one with Arnold Schwarzenegger eating like a bunch of noodles. There's a really great Charlie Sheen one. I think you can see it on YouTube. And I remember they interviewed Charlie Sheen about that, and he said, "Yeah, I don't want my commercials to be shown in America because I want people to pay to see me on the screen. I don't want them to see me for free." And that was a part of the reason why you wouldn't do TV. You want the audience to pay for you. Now it's a completely different environment, right? Now you can, with prestige TV, with commercials paying so much. Now it's like, every Super Bowl, there's like new stars doing commercials, or they just do commercials as it is. Zoe Saldana doing what is it she does? T-Mobile commercials. Like, you wouldn't see that now, especially a star that's as bankable as her. You wouldn't see her doing that kind of stuff back then. But now, of course, it's just more commonplace to get as much money as you can, as fast as you can, because you don't know when the money's going to dry out, because the studios are quick to pull it as well. So that's why we have a Beverly Hills Cop 2 and not a TV series, is because Eddie Murphy wanted to do another movie. A few other pieces of the production important to point out. One of them is that Ronnie Cox was doing RoboCop. Remember we talked about Ronnie Cox? He got the role in RoboCop because of his performance in Beverly Hills Cop. Well, now RoboCop is running up against the production of Beverly Hills Cop, and it's like, well, he really can't be in it, so we got to have Brigitte Nielsen shoot him, right, and have him be like recovering in the hospital while everybody else is running around doing everything because he's not available as much. So that was one piece of it, right? That's why we have Bogomil getting shot at the beginning, and that's the reason why Axel comes back out to L.A. is because they want to find out who the killer is, who the shooter was, all of that. So that's one piece. The reason why we've got Bob Seger doing Shakedown, the theme song for Beverly Hills Cop, and not Glenn Frey, is that Glenn Frey was sick when he was supposed to record that song. So Bob Seger, it's his only number one hit. All the songs, right, Like a Rock, I drawn a blank on everything else because I'm just thinking of other songs, and it's just all Hollywood. What was that? Hollywood Nights. That was it's so many songs that he had in the '80s, right? Mr. Bob Seger. This is his one number one hit was Shakedown. I don't think it did as well as I guess it probably did. There wasn't the soundtrack itself didn't do as well as the previous film's soundtrack. And I think it's just because it didn't have as many good songs. The Pointer Sisters song on the second one is not as good as Neutron Dance. I can't remember what that song was. It's played in the movie, but you had I'm trying to think of the other songs that were. George Michael's "I Want Your Sex," which of course that one wasn't written for the movie. It was kind of like Vanity Six's, her song being played in the strip club. That was like the stripper danced to that song and said, let's use that song. I don't think that was the case here, but they did pull that song outside of the movie and used it in there. So it wasn't one that was written directly for it. But yeah, you didn't have as many of the great songs on there. And I think overall this movie, right, it's not the kind of out-and-out classic that the first one is, but it's still a lot of fun. It still hits a lot of really nice spots. It still has that beautiful 80s feel to it that I was talking about in the previous one. Yes, there's a sense that we are getting closer to the 90s. when the 90s start, right, things change quite a bit. It's such a fascinating difference. I mean, what's interesting about the 90s is that, from my mindset, of course, being born in 79, the 90s almost start in like 88, 89 for me because of the way it seemed like the world was kind of almost preparing for it. Like songs would be mentioning the 90s, that kind of thing. But then there's also a sense that the 90s start like maybe for Americans, like when Bill Clinton plays the saxophone, or the Clinton administration overall, and that's kind of more the 90s. So you can tell, but there's definitely an aesthetic change that starts to happen in the late 80s. And this movie's right on the cusp of it. It's just starting to give you that a little bit there. Movies that are made in like 88, 89 definitely have more of that aesthetic change. But this one was starting it. This is kind of what, in that opening period there. And of course, we got Brigitte Nielsen in this one. We got all kinds of great characters. Maybe I'll get into all the names that we have here. But, Brigitte Nielsen, obviously, we talk about her being in Cobra as well. And of course, she was in the fourth Rocky movie. This larger-than-life figure that would do these movies and these roles. She was like another big piece of the 80s. And it's almost like you can't do a movie like this. Like, if you're going to do the first one without her, you couldn't do the second one without her. So that's another piece there. Tony Scott directs it. So he gets this gig after doing Top Gun. Bruckheimer and Don Simpson, they loved him doing Top Gun. They said, all right, let's bring him in for this. That's different from the first director, who was Martin Brest, who... he was fired from another movie that he was doing. I can't remember which one that was. But Bruckheimer and Simpson wanted him to do Beverly Hills Cop, and he was really hesitant, and he didn't want to do it. Ends up flipping a coin, and I guess the coin was whatever it was supposed to be for him to choose the movie. And he like has that coin framed because it was such a big deal for him to do the movie. But they couldn't get him back for this one, so they did Tony Scott. And the interesting thing about Tony Scott is that he's not really a comedic actor. So difference between with Brest and Scott is that Brest was more able to do comedic scenes, and he had to punch up the action. He had stress, like he talked about that final shootout at the mansion was very stressful for him to shoot that, because it just was a lot of different angles, a lot of different scenes. And that was something that was difficult for him. For Tony Scott, right, that would be an easy thing to do, but the comedic stuff was a little bit harder for him. And I think it does show in the final product. I don't think you have as many laugh out loud moments in this one as you have in the previous one. But it still is a lot of fun and still hits all the spots that I would want. Like if there were going to be a sequel to Beverly Hills Cop 2, this is definitely... This is pretty much what I would want it to be. Like, if you're going to say, who should the baddie be? And then you said, we've got Jürgen Proch now. Yeah, that's the baddie that I would want. And then Brigitte Nielsen being sort of like the femme fatale character in there. Yeah, exactly. That works for me. Dean Stockwell as like kind of the head henchman who, we know isn't going to last, and he's going to get killed by the baddie because he's just a jerk off, right? Yeah, give us that guy. Alan Garfield as Harold Lutz, the new chief, right? Who's firing everybody in the police station, who's a complete jerk, right? Just the name Lutz, right? It's just so beautiful. Like, of course, Alan Garfield. Yes, that's who I want. Put that guy in there. Of course, sign him up as fast as you can. So I loved all that. There's the Gilbert Gottfried scene, right, where he plays Sidney Bernstein. I found out that was almost entirely improvised between him and Eddie Murphy, which was just fantastic. And when you see how young he looks in this scene in this movie in 1987, I had forgotten. I guess I thought he was older than that. And maybe he was, and he just looked young. But he does. He looks very young in that scene. So yeah, he was 32. He looked like a young 32 compared to what we usually see where he looks like an old 32. Which is a shame that he's passed away, because he wasn't that old. He was essentially the same age as my mom. It's just, it's kind of sad that he's already left us, considering, it's classic Gilbert Gottfried in this one scene that you see him in. But what's great is, again, the fact that he and Eddie Murphy are completely, improvising that scene. But, so, I don't know. I guess I could do a quick synopsis here. Essentially, Axel Foley's back in Detroit. He's trying to bust a credit card smuggling ring, driving around in a Ferrari, doing all that undercover stuff. And then he gets the call that Bogomil has been hit. And so what's happening at the same time is there's the string of robberies that's happening by these alphabet thieves. They leave a card with a letter on it and some cryptic, some kind of code or whatever in there. And it feels like Bogomil, Ronnie Cox, is close to cracking this case. and he's almost there, and he goes out for a jog one day, and he gets, a beautiful blonde woman, or actually beautiful brunette, is sitting at her Mercedes, looking for someone to help her. Of course, Ronnie Cox is plenty happy to help her. Turns out she's Brigitte Nielsen, and her and some other guys in the Jürgen Prochnow gang, they shoot up good old Ronnie Cox, and now he's in the hospital. Well, when Foley gets to town, he's like, hey, man, he says to Rosewood and Taggart, like, what are we going to do? We got to solve this. And they're like, well, we got this Lutz guy who's our new chief, and he's not going to let us do anything. Foley's like, well, why is that going to stop us, right? We got, a good hour and 20 minutes left of movie here to kill. We got to do something, right? So that's when they go. They go out there and they start trying to solve the case. And it leads into this big, like, gun running thing that Prochnow's involved with. That there's all these sort of, like, layers to it. They end up what do I say, boggling. They end up foiling one of the crimes, and so that now Prochnow's kind of targeting them as well, and it's kind of a cat and mouse thing. The same time that Lutz, Alan Garfield's giving everybody a hard time and not letting anybody do their job, and the whole thing ends with this really big shootout with a bunch of explosions and all of that stuff near a racetrack. And it's exactly what you want from a movie like this, right? This is the kind of that perfect, whether it's, I obviously I wouldn't have seen this in the theater. I can't remember if I saw the third one in the theater or not. I think I saw that one as like a HBO, like, free weekend kind of thing. So that's how I saw that one. But this one I would have seen on TV. I also would have maybe rented it or saw it on HBO as well to get like the profane version, right? The swearing version of it. But it's that perfect time killer, that perfect, whether it's a Saturday night or Friday night or afternoon movie, if it's on in an afternoon, if you're watching it with friends, watching it by yourself, you're in and out in an hour and 40 minutes. All of it just works on that score. And so it's not as good as the first one. I don't think that. Now, this was more successful than the first one, and I think that just sort of solidifies that Eddie Murphy was, much more bankable. That he was that kind of the number one star for the end of the 80s. Right, this budget is a budget of like almost 30 million, and it makes almost 300 million worldwide. I think when it was adjusted for inflation, I think it's been adjusted for inflation. I think it's like the 46th highest grossing movie ever. Just absolutely insane. And some people do like this one better than the first one. I don't. I think the first one was just watching them back to back like that. Definitely just a ton of fun. But definitely I prefer the first one to this one. But that doesn't mean I don't like this one. You're watching them back to back like that was a lot of fun to do as well. But you could watch this one by itself too. If you've seen, there isn't much from the first one that you need to pull from this one. You just need to know that they all know each other and that there was a whole thing that happened in the I don't even think I don't think Ronnie Cox's daughter's in the first one. They kind of bring her up like everybody knows each other. And, it's like, okay, well, I guess she's there. But anyway, but yeah, so that was a piece of this that I really liked. Now, one of the things I teased in the previous segment was this idea of sort of almost artificially extending movies to make them longer because you feel like you have to make them longer. And this movie really fits the bill of what a good 105 minute movie should be. And I do think if this movie was made today, they would stretch it out to 2 hours and 25 minutes, and it wouldn't have been as good. It didn't need to be 2 hours and 25 minutes. I think, the kind of the pacing and the way the story goes is that you get that initial robbery, you get Bogomil kind of trying to investigate things. You've also got what Foley is doing in Detroit, sort of the interplay between him and Reiser, and of course Gil Hill is back, Inspector Todd is back. So you get a little of those things, and then you get sort of that first plot point, right? That they shoot up Bogomil. And then while that's happening, there's sort of the investigation pieces. They go to the gun range and meet Prochnow and meet everybody, kind of, okay, these are our baddies here. We know they're our baddies. We just got to prove it, And then, there's the nightclub scene. And they're sort of figuring out that where the next hit is going to be. And so when they figure out where the next hit's going to be, they foil it. And then they got to figure out where the one after that is. And they discover, okay, it's at the racetrack. And that's kind of where the denouement is. And I think if this was made today, there'd be much more stuff going on in the middle. You might have a situation where Lutz, for example, maybe he arrests them. They end up in prison. They've got to get their way out of prison. There'd be another, like, almost catching them, not quite catching them sort of thing. Probably more heists, right? You probably have more heists and things like that are added. Obviously that tacks onto the budget as well. Right now, when you're trying to make this movie, 2 hours and 25 minutes, now your budget is getting over the 100 million mark. It's getting into like the 120, 150 million mark. That means now you suddenly need to make more in the opening weekend. If the opening weekend fails, now suddenly it's not worth as much to put all this into it. And I do wonder if for film studios, if this is maybe where you need to go back to, is to make, like, I don't know. I was trying to think of like some of the new movies that have come out that have been kind of mediocre, right? That haven't done as well. And what are, like that Fall Guy movie, for example. That one didn't do quite as hot. 2 hours and 6 minutes long. Does it need to be 2 hours and 6, or could you do it in an hour and 40 or something like that? And does that sort of lessen the budget a bit, right? Because that budget was something in the it was 125 million. Well, could you do it for an hour and a half or an hour and 35 minutes and get it in under 75 million? Well, now that gross of 181 million doesn't feel as bad when you're only spending 75, and also maybe you get a little bit more gate there because it doesn't look like a flop right away. Because I think that's the other piece of it. Sometimes these are like self-perpetuating flops, right? That once the word gets out that the movie's a flop, then everybody starts talking about it like a flop, and you can't. I don't know. That sort of that momentum, that I could call it flop momentum. Is that right? That flop momentum. This is becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. Now nobody wants to go see the movie. And that Furiosa movie, right? Another one just didn't do well, right? A budget of essentially made its budget. Well, it didn't make its budget back, right? Because again, you got to make 3 times your budget. Well, so you're spending 170 million to make a 2 hour and 28 minute Mad Max movie. Couldn't you shrink that down by 45 minutes and make it for 85 million? Well, now you're making double your. If you gross 170 with an $80 million movie, you're doubling your budget back. I mean, I just think that like all of these, they don't need to always be events, because the thing is, Beverly Hills Cop 2 was an event in 1987. I didn't go see it. I was too young. I was 8. So that was definitely a for an R-rated movie, like something like that as an 8-year-old. That was definitely something that was going to be an HBO special at somebody's house who had HBO, or a rental or something like that. I think that was enough of an event. It was a number one movie of the year. And again, it's like the 46th highest grossing movie of all time, adjusted for inflation. It didn't need to be 2 hours and 23 minutes long. They got in exactly what they need to do in an hour and 43. But it is interesting watching it that as I was watching it, I was imagining what a modern movie maker would do with this movie. I was imagining the ways that they would add scenes, that they would fluff things out or pad things out. They would need more action sequences. And it's not worth it. It's not. You don't need to do it. This movie tells you that you don't need to do it. So I think that's another thing about that makes these movies work so well, is that you can get in and out in an hour and 43 minutes like that. More movies need to do that. More filmmakers need to do that kind of thing. Now, one of the things I was reading about on here is that sort of in the background, again, we talked about the fact that Eddie Murphy, this is only his this is the only movie that he does between this and the previous one is The Golden Child, so he's not doing as much stuff. There was a sense that he was starting to become maybe more of a prima donna, which is interesting because he's only 26 when he's making this. But I guess that could happen, right? If you're young and you get this kind of success when you're young, it could go to your head quicker, right? That's definitely a possibility. And I think that's what we might start to see, is we start to see things kind of dip for him. But looking at his career between now and when we talk again, when we do the third movie, he's got some classics in there, right? Coming to America, Harlem Nights. Those are two of my favorite of his movies. It does finally there's a 48 Hours sequel, but then Boomerang, Vampire in Brooklyn, it starts to go down a little bit, and I think it'll be interesting when we get into those those other movies of his, when we between now and the third film. Because I don't know if he had planned on making a third Beverly Hills Cop. I mean, obviously with how successful it was, they were probably pushing him to make a third Beverly Hills Cop, and he was pushing it off, right? He didn't want to do it. So I think Paramount would have wanted this movie now, right? They wouldn't have wanted this movie, 3 years from now or something like that. So I think that's it's a big piece of it. The other thing about this, so again, maybe Eddie Murphy is maybe potentially becoming a bit of a diva or harder to work with on set. That's possible. That's happening there. But the other thing that's interesting about this is that Paramount's, we've talked about this in the Star Trek ones, right? That Paramount's major franchise at that time was Star Trek. And the Beverly Hills Cop movies were outperforming the Star Trek films. Beverly Hills Cop had become their most successful franchise. And I think, they've tried, obviously, I think Transformers is another one, Mission Impossible is a Paramount one. So they've definitely tried to kind of, recreate the magic. And of course, Star Trek is still their biggest franchise, I think, or one, either that one or Transformers. I guess it probably would be Star Trek because they can make all the TV shows and stuff. But it is interesting to think about like what Beverly Hills Cop, either had, Murphy stuck with it, wanted to do more stuff. Had the third one been a better movie? Because when we talk about that, that's going to be an interesting thing. Because that's kind of what I think causes them to put the whole series to bed. Is that third one, how poorly that one does. But this was at this time, while Eddie Murphy is making himself the most bankable star in the business, Paramount is looking at it as like, this is doing a lot better for us than Star Trek is, and that was their big space franchise, and it turns out what they end up getting, right, with their I don't know how I want to say it. What they end up getting is this franchise out of nowhere. I guess what I'm trying to say is what happens with Universal, where they're also trying to push different franchises, and they get this sudden thing with Fast and Furious, and they're at least with them they were able to kind of, because I think that there's sort of this perfect mix of the Fast and the Furious really hits pay dirt with the fourth and probably more the fifth movie, right? But it happens at a time where Vin Diesel was kind of on the verge of direct-to-video. If you remember, he'd had some duds, and with that fourth movie, when he made the fourth movie for Universal, they were like, he wanted to do sequels after that, and they were like, let's see how this fourth one does first before we start signing you on to more stuff. And I don't, if that hadn't done well, I think he would have probably been in the DTV space. But because it did do well enough that it could get a fifth, and then of course the fifth one that starts to take off, and 6, 7, they just start doing really well. It was sort of this accidental franchise thing, but for Vin Diesel, it was one of those things that he wanted to keep making them, right? Because he had been kind of close to the outs, or his career wasn't doing as well, so he wanted this kind of thing. Whereas for Eddie Murphy, he's just starting his career when he has this kind of success. So he wouldn't be thinking about wanting to turn Beverly Hills Cop into a Fast and Furious kind of franchise. He's more like, I want to branch out and do other stuff. There was probably a sense of like, anything I make is going to make money, so let's just do all kinds of different projects. It's interesting because imagining if they had gone that route, where maybe you get part 3 in 1990 and part 4 in 93 or something like that. I mean, first off, how many parts would you get? I mean, there probably would be a point where, because back then we didn't do these big, long franchises like we do now. So maybe 3 or 4 might have been enough. And then you say, okay, we're good here, and we take a break on it. But it is interesting to think of Beverly Hills Cop as having that kind of potential to be, imagining Beverly Hills Cop. And again, I haven't seen the fourth one yet. I'll be watching it, for the episode in 2 weeks, but imagining a Beverly Hills Cop franchise where you've got like Judge Reinhold hanging off the side of a plane, right? Or maybe Taggart and Rosewood driving it out of outer space. Like, how far do you take it, right? How far would this thing have been taken? I gotta feel like Eddie Murphy's, he's no Vin Diesel. I mean, he's a bigger deal than Vin Diesel for a reason. That he probably wouldn't go that crazy with it, but it is interesting to think about how far Beverly Hills Cop could have gone based off of these 2 movies and based off of Paramount maybe wanting another franchise that could cover for the fact that Star Trek wasn't doing as well. Again, later they end up getting Transformers, they end up getting Mission Impossible, and so those are a little bit more bigger for them. But I think it's also probably why they weren't sure with Beverly Hills Cop. I think they had talked about maybe putting that in the theater, but then they decided the Axel F movie, they decided to ship it off to Netflix and have them try it, which means they don't get to have it on their streaming service. It was like a gamble that I guess Paramount Plus thought they would make more money, and it probably was a smarter play to make more money by having it on Netflix, which has a bigger subscriber base than what they have. Anyway, so kind of getting way off track there on that. Now speaking of Paramount Plus, right? Now I watched this on Paramount Plus, and I have kind of a funny story about watching this movie. So I was watching on my tablet on the bus ride back from New England from visiting my family. So what had happened was that I was usually I take a train both ways, but the thing was coming back. I needed to pick up a prescription for my wife, and so the train would have gotten me back too late. So I was going to take this coach bus from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, that goes to New York City at like 6 in the morning. And when I found out I didn't end up having to pick up that prescription for her, I was like, well, I don't need to get back that early, so I'm not doing a 6 o'clock in the morning bus. But at that point, the trains were all too expensive, so I got this thing called the Flix bus. 45 years old, I probably don't need to be taking the Flix bus. It's a low-cost bus from Boston to New York. First off, when the guy picks us up, he doesn't even have a Flix bus. He's got like some random coach that looks like something that you take on a tour or something like that. We're like the Flix thing they were talking about. Everybody has assigned seats. You get on the bus. There's no assigned seats. So luckily I didn't pay for my own seat because I wouldn't have had I had my own seat because there weren't enough people on the bus. But anyway. At a certain point, my coffee and whatever is going through me, and I had to go to the bathroom. And I knew I had about a good 2 hours left on this trip, and they had a bathroom in the back. So as I'm going to the back, there's definitely people like they're just kind of ruffians. They're just laying with their legs across the aisles because this is like a one of those wretched wretched hive of scum and villainy kind of deals. And the first one moves, but I get to the end, and there's a dude who's laying like kind of right across where the bathroom is. And he's asleep, and I'm like, I think I can get over him. I think I can jump him. I think if I get my hands on either side of the thing, I can get over him. And I do it, and I come down, and my leg kind of brushes against his leg that's laying there, and he freaked out. He was like, what the fuck? What's going on? And I was like, oh, sorry, man. I ended up scratching my leg as well, but he's like, oh, what the fuck? And I was like, whatever. So I go to the bathroom, I come out, and he was like on his phone, and I was like, hey, sorry again, whatever. And he was like, okay. But like that confrontation of it kind of freaked me out. It kind of spooked me a bit, and I was like, damn it, like what if he comes after me? Like what if he comes up, because what's going to happen if he wants to come, he decides to use pistol, like if I had actually hurt his leg, which I don't think I did, but he could have come, and I was like watching the movie, but kind of looking up to see like how much time we had left on the bus, and where we were, and if he was, one of the things I realized, because I was going to make myself look a little different, like not have my hat on and stuff like that. I was the only white guy on the bus, so if he was going to come looking for me, he just process of elimination, and then anyway too, like I was gonna try to get off the bus like before him, but he ended up like zooming to the front. I was like, oh shit, well is he gonna, if he's pissed, he might wait for him or whatever. But I didn't really learn my lesson. You just gotta, one, don't need to be taking the Flix bus, but two, probably don't, if somebody's like sleeping across the aisle. I mean, yes, I learned my lesson. I probably shouldn't. At 45, I also probably don't need to be trying to jump over people. That's probably not going to work. But I guess he probably also learned his lesson too. You don't need to be stretching your legs out across the aisle like that. Listen, this is you pay for one seat, you sit in one seat. That's what you do. That's it. But either way. But anyway, it did kind of make me. I was a little distracted watching Beverly Hills Cop 2. I was kind of going back if I missed things. Like there's a scene where Axel Foley gets caught by the baddies, and they're taking him, frog marching him. Did you hear the Boston accent? Frog matching him at gunpoint. But and then the next thing he's like kind of back with Taggart and Rosewood, and they're shooting at people. And I was like, well, how did he get away? I missed that. So then I rewound it back and saw, okay, it's because there's when Rosewood shoots off the big missile, the rocket launcher thing, that kind of leads to. It distracts the baddie that was holding him hostage, and then he's able to beat that guy up and defeat him. So, but yeah, I'm kind of embarrassed even telling the story. I was like, what was I thinking doing that? I even told my wife that. I got a pretty good scratch on my leg too when I landed. I must have scratched on one of the other seats or something, and so I probably have to get some Neosporin for that because I think it might be infected. We'll see. It'll lose the bottom half of my leg for taking the Flix bus because I was trying to save a little money instead of taking the train. That's the best idea. That was like when I got into New York City. There's a nice pizza place in Penn Station on the New Jersey Transit side that was really good. I always try to get some there. So I got a nice slice of mushroom there and got out of Dodge. So not a bad deal. I was there again for work on Wednesday, and so there's another pizza place on the other side, on the Moynihan side, that also is really good. So if you get some pizza while you're waiting for your train in New York, you definitely got some good options there for sure. But yeah, so that story there done. I was trying to think if there was anything else here that I wanted to mention about this movie, because it is definitely a fun time. It definitely gets you to the church on time. It works, how you'd want a movie like this to work. It's a good sequel, right? It's a time when sequels, it's from a time when we expected sequels to not be as good as the first movie, but they're good enough, right? They do enough of what you want to say there. So that's true. Oh, one thing I did forget to mention is we get Chris Rock as the parking valet in this film. And in the previous one, we had Damon Wayans, right? He's the guy who gives the bananas to, he's the guy working at the buffet who gives the bananas to Eddie Murphy. Yeah, just forget his name, the main star of the movie. But anyway, so one of the things, I think one of the criticisms that Spike Lee leveled criticism on Eddie Murphy, that he wasn't doing enough for other black actors in films. But, part of it is, right, that he does these movies where he's giving, these comedians their first acting gigs, right? He's getting them in these movies themselves. But then, of course, right, he goes on and he makes, Harlem Nights, Coming to America, which are almost entirely black casts. So, and I want to say that the criticism came in 88. So it was almost like, he had these other movies coming. It's almost, you think that Spike Lee would have known. But I definitely do think that, as much as you could look at these movies and say, yeah, they're mostly just all white people with Eddie Murphy, and then of course Gil Hill as the other cop in Detroit. But for the most part, right, they're white casts. But I think the fact that it did seem like he was trying to get fellow black comedians roles in these movies, and then of course what he ends up doing later with the kind of credibility, with the kind of market that he's built for himself, what he does later in the decade, a year or two after this. I think, that criticism, it's interesting, hearing it. I think if you're Spike Lee and you're watching these movies, I guess I could see where you might have that criticism. But, and I think also maybe kind of looking at OJ at that time and kind of what OJ was doing, that you might, that might be, he might have been thinking that Eddie Murphy is going to be like another OJ, but it really isn't that. Now, I do wonder, because I don't think they've ever worked together, and I do wonder if, that's part of it, is that he just, Eddie Murphy didn't respect, that was upset that he gave him a hard time. Interesting thing about that, right, is that I read that part of the reason why he didn't come back for any of the reunions for Saturday Night Live, he never did Saturday Night Live for any of his other movies, or any of that stuff, was that David Spade, on Saturday Night Live, I think it was the Weekend Update, when he would talk about movies, he made fun of Eddie Murphy, and Murphy was pissed about that, and so he just, that's it, I'm not doing anything with you guys. So I kind of wonder, that's kind of a similar thing, Spike Lee, says something about him not helping out other black talent, and he says, yeah, okay, well, I'm not going to work with you. So I don't know, but yeah, but again, kind of just wrapping it up here, I think this is another fun movie. These two together are fantastic. Again, I don't put the second one up there with the first one as one of my all-time favorite actioners. I do think if I'm comparing Die Hard 2 and Die Hard 1 and then this one and the first one, I like this one definitely. This one's better than Die Hard 2 for me. I enjoyed this one better in that sense. So, it's just a lot of fun talking about these movies. So I'm excited that we did this. I'm curious to see what these next two are going to do for us when we get into those. We'll kind of see what happens there. But I think we covered everything that we want to here. We're going to go 35 minutes here on the second film. And so, again, these are both on Paramount Plus. So if you have Paramount Plus, I think it's worth checking them out if you haven't seen them in a while. They're a lot of fun. And I think, again, we got kind of the current state of action where we get hit or miss a lot of times. These are some fun ones to just kind of fire up. And especially as we're getting to the holidays here in the U.S., I think especially with Thanksgiving, whatever. These are some good time killers. These will make you feel a lot better than maybe watching some NFL football or something like that. So, So anyway, we'll wrap this up here. Plugs, again, the site, dtvconnoisseur.blogspot.com. That's where you can find links to everything. My newest novel, Don's House in the Mountains. Check that out. Kindle Unlimited, paperback. Always appreciate anybody who wants to buy those. And again, the new one, we're going to try to get the new one, Nadia and Aiden, out probably sometime in December. So keep an eye out for that as well. All right. Well, thank you everybody for listening, and we'll be back soon. Bye, everyone.
There